Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think it's time to get started. My name is Dorothy Tarrant, and I'm very pleased to welcome you this afternoon in the name of Wider Horizons, a group from St Andrews and St George's West. In normal times, one of the most popular activities of Wider Horizons is organising monthly fellowship lunches. These give church folks the opportunity to share a simple meal after the Sunday service and enjoy conversation around the tables in the Undercroft, while at the same time supporting a range of charitable organisations recommended by members of the congregation. The last fellowship lunch was in March of last year. Last July, we had planned to have a fellowship lunch to support Edinburgh DIrect Aid, but of course it had to be cancelled because of COVID regulations. In the meantime, fellowship lunches have been replaced by virtual afternoon teas. So I hope you've all settled down with a cup of tea or a mug of coffee, a piece of cake and a scone. I'm sorry we couldn't provide those for you. Maybe this time next year we'll be able to. You're going to hear live from key players in the life and work of Edinburgh DIrect Aid. EDA began back in 1992 in response to the war in the former Yugoslavia. Andrew McClellan was minister of St Andrews and St George's at that time. He has been an enthusiastic supporter of EDA ever since, and he continues to serve the organisation as a trustee. We're delighted that Andrew is here with us today, and he's going to share some of the memories of how EDA got started, and then introduce you to EDA's founders, Dennis Rutovitz and Jean Bell. Andrew McClellan is no stranger to many of you, and so I'm delighted to hand over to him.
Thank you, Dorothy. I remember a tremendous Sunday morning, lots of people in church, and we all poured out of the church at the end of the service onto the pavement in George Street, singing a hymn with lumps in our throats, because we were waving goodbye to 4 friends of ours who were about to drive all across Europe into one of the most dangerous places in the world, taking with them vans full of medical supplies and food. I want to talk just now about 3 people who were key for me on that Sunday morning. So let's start on the left. The one on the left is Jean Bell, and Jean was already in those days a top-notch academic, but we knew her in the congregation as a caring and devoted elder. She came to me with a crazy idea that she and her husband had together, that they would set off from Edinburgh, taking whatever they could lay their hands on to meet the desperate needs of the people in the collapsed Yugoslavia in the midst of the most brutal civil war. I immediately agreed for Jan's suggestion that she would speak in church that morning, and when she spoke about this crazy daft idea, you could not but be moved with tears in your eyes. Next person in the picture is her husband Dennis. The dreadfulness, the cruelty of what was happening in former Yugoslavia was on newspaper headlines and on television every day. The savagery of a civil war beyond belief. And everybody was saying, something must be done. Something must be done. Except for Dennis Rutovitz, who said, something must be done and we must do it. I often say that Dennis is a genius at compassion, not just a genius at hearing the cries of the wretched of the earth, but a genius at enabling others to have some structure to their compassion and do something with the feelings of care that they have. The third person, the person on the extreme right of the picture, is the head of the School of Government at Oxford University. It's Callum Miller, but I suspect since he's 13 in that picture, he may not just have become head of School of Government at Oxford, though he probably could have at the time. Callum did 2 things. First of all, when Jean was speaking about what their plan was, Callum nudged his mother and said, "Mum, you should go." And go she did. And the second thing that Callum did was he wrote to his head teacher at school and told them about this project which was being given birth to. And within a week, the school had raised 1,100 blankets and £1,000. EDA was on its way. So at the end of the service, everybody spilled out onto the pavement. And we all gathered together with lumps in our throats to say goodbye to everybody. The vans were waiting, and we all gathered together and we sang. I remember we sang the 121st Psalm, the Pilgrim's Psalm, "I to the hills will lift mine eyes, from whence doth come mine aid? The Lord will keep thy soul, he shall preserve thee from all ill. Henceforth thy going out and in, God keep forever will." And this is a picture of Deborah Miller, Callum's mother. She was to share the driving with a member of St Andrews and St George's who at the last moment had to withdraw because of health problems. So almost the day before, Deborah was told that she would be driving a van, accompanied, cooped up in the van with a complete stranger, somebody she didn't know at all, half her age, with, as she said to me, unusual personal habits. Well, they set off together in a van with the others. Jan and Dennis in one van, Deborah and this other person in the other van, and we all had lumps in our throats as they jumped into the van and set off to drive to Bosnia. No one ever said that life with Dennis Rutovitz would be dull. So now it's time to meet Jan and Dennis.
Hello everybody, I'm Jan and this is my husband Dennis. Well, after that wonderful send-off from St Andrews and St George's, we did indeed get to the former Yugoslavia several times that year. And Dennis was already forming a plan to reach Sarajevo by Christmas. Sarajevo was the besieged capital of Bosnia, lying in a hollow amongst the hills from which the Serbs were raining mortar bombs down on the city. We succeeded in getting in at Christmas that year, the most memorable Christmas we've ever spent. We arrived in Sarajevo and we sheltered in the main hospital in Sarajevo. This is the state in which we found it. No electricity, no running water, and heavily shelled, and yet they were going on caring for patients in that building. Meanwhile, back in Scotland, the support was growing, and soon we had convoys of vehicles on the road through the winter conditions and reaching all parts of Bosnia and sometimes into besieged Sarajevo. This is a slide showing Christine Whitcutt and her husband Alan Whitcutt. In July the following year, Christine, on a convoy coming out of Sarajevo, was killed with a sniper's bullet. This terrible tragedy threatened to tear apart EDA, but Alan offered his ongoing support for the charity and said that Christine would have wanted us to carry on. And indeed we did. Later, when the war was over, we set up a charity in Christine's memory, the Christine Whitcutt Centre, which cares for children and young people with special needs. And here you can see one of the ones that we care for. This is still ongoing in Sarajevo. After the war, we set about trying to help the Bosnian refugees who had settled, fled to UK, and settled for the duration of the war, but who wished to return to Bosnia. Their houses, of course, were ruined, so we had a large rebuilding program, upwards of 10 million, I think, between here and the later program in Kosovo, And this was funded by the European Commission, by USAID, by the Portuguese Embassy, and by Christian Aid, familiar to St Andrews and St George's. And with this help, we rebuilt houses and clinics and schools for the people who were returning. EDA by this time had been registered as a charity in Scotland and continues to this day. We are an all-volunteer and international charity, and our spread has increased around the world, as I'll show you in the next slide. Our sister charity, the Christine Whitcutt Memorial Fund, was set up in Christine's memory and manages the Christine Whitcutt Centre and Outreach Service. And you will ask, where does the funding come from? From public donations, trust funds, charitable organisations like Christian Aid, and government grants. The government grants being for specific large projects that we undertake, like the rebuilding. Since Bosnia, all the years intervening I could summarise in this one slide by all of these places that EDA has operated in. Lots of stories attached to each of them which I cannot tell now. But right now we are working mainly in Lebanon, and there we are working with Syrian refugees. And we are working in a place called Arsal. We came to Arsal after some research undertaken by Maggie Tukey and John Hume Robertson. You'll hear from Maggie directly later in this presentation. They fixed on Arsal as a place where EDA could have a niche benefit to the people in need there. 100,000 refugees flooded across the border to Arsal, a tiny town of 35,000 inhabitants, very close to the Syrian border. In Arsal, from that day, the key people who have kept things going in Arsal have been Maggie herself, and first Mo Katbi, and then his son-in-law, Nabil, whom you will see later in the presentations. You'll see photographs of each of these as we go through. And now we're going to show a video to give you some idea of what life is like in Arsal and what EDA has accomplished there.
شفته انبسطت غشاكل لانه هو بيعرفني انا بعرفه من زمان وبيعرفنا وعارفين كل قصصنا.
These people have come from nice lives in Syria, nice homes, and now they find themselves living in a horrible plastic coal box with about 16 other people, children who have nothing to do all day, and they have to still get through this winter. And they have to face a boiling hot summer up here in these greenhouses of shelters.
وتاني شي نحن فقدنا يعني بيتنا اللي كنا قاعدين فيه، وشوف فيه تفرح فيه يعني تلاقيه جنة قدامك، أو يعني ما كنا عايشين هيك.
People always say, well, it's only a drop in the ocean, so is it worth it? And of course, every tiny drop has to be worth it. It's so important.
It's amazing the quality of donations that you get. You know, people give really good things. All our donations come from the public, often through a church or a mosque or a school, but essentially from the public.
هذا الشغل من هون لا ايه لا ثاني ولا شو قصتهم هون شوفي ايه منين لوين
The video gave you some idea of what we're doing in our cell. We have one other very interesting link back to our work in Sarajevo, in that the needs of the children and young people with special needs in our cell has not been neglected, and we support a centre there for those people. And that is, all of these activities, of course, have been partially suspended or completely suspended during the pandemic, but they're ready to spring into action again once this pandemic is over. Now I'd like to give Maggie a chance to present one particular challenge that we have in our cell, those terrible winters.
There's one challenge that never stops for the pandemic, and that is the terrible winters that our cell tends to suffer, and every winter. It's a high place. It's approximately 1,700 metres. That's about 5,500 feet at the highest camps up near the border. The storms are fierce and frequent. The refugees live in the most flimsy of shelters, really, that collapse easily under snow. Hypothermia strikes every winter in the young and the old, and is common, sometimes leading to death. It's always the way that when we're there during the winter and the storms moved in, we get the most urgent messages coming through on the phone to Nabil, our manager there, and I'm there with him. And it's usually at night and in the height of the storm, and it's the people from the highest camps saying they need help. So we have a four-wheel drive, so we go out in the storm. The driving conditions are pretty terrible, as you can see from the picture. The highest camps close to the border are most at risk, and these are the camps which we try to reach with food and heating oil, which is probably even more vital. So this is an example, 9 p.m. at night. This was reaching the very highest camp that we have in our cell up in the mountains. We'd driven up and we'd had urgent requests for food and heating oil, and we were delivering. This picture just shows Nabil and I trying to get the bread out of a frozen sack with frozen hands, and the wind chill factor phenomenal. And then we also had heating oil in the truck, which we got out shortly after this picture was taken. And then we have to get back down, and the road is solid ice, very narrow, very tricky, sliding all over the place, but it's a pretty important job to do. We usually manage it very safely because Nabil is an excellent driver, and I'm sitting there pretty nervous, but we managed to get down. Without heating oil, I said that heating oil is probably one of the most important things. Without it, simply people die in those storms, because once the heat has gone and the stove has gone out, the temperature plummets inside those tents. The temperature can reach -18, sometimes did this winter, and the oil stoves then must be kept burning in the tents all through the night, just to keep that heat going. It's essential to do that, but they need the oil, of course. And this was in a lower camp, actually. We managed to get the oil tanker into this camp, which is much quicker, and then people, of course, bring out their cans. We fill them as quickly as possible and then move on to the next camp. It's just really a race against time before the storm rises again, because it tends to wax and wane, the storm, and you know that it's going to come roaring in again very shortly. When the storm passes, this is usually the scene. These are, again, high camps, but most camps are looking like this the next day. And the weight of the snow is a big problem, so people have to get out and clear that snow off the roof if they can get out, and sometimes they're so blocked in. And this is typical of a camp after the storm has passed the next morning. And then we do potato deliveries as well. So we're pretty varied in what we can deliver. This was to a mid-level camp above the town, and potatoes are one of the staples. We can get quite a few deliveries done if the camp isn't too far. So this was, again, the people, it's just, they're so happy to see us with a truck carrying whatever it's got in it, bread, oil, potatoes, ourselves, So it's a good job to be doing. And in this particular store, EDA had distributed large food boxes with all the staples in to around, this is just a few statistics out of interest, 450 families plus the bread and potatoes. And with the help of some American donors on this particular winter that we met in Beirut during the explosion time, which you'll hear more about later from me, EDA had distributed heating oil with all the funding that we got in to about 1,100 families. So we did a huge amount this winter, thanks to Nabil and thanks to our donors.
Now Dennis is going to speak about some of the other challenges in Arsal and some of what we are doing with Nabil.
I sometimes describe Maggie as our general purpose Wonder Woman. Whenever we need an amazing task to be done, we call her Maggie. But she's not the only amazing person on the scene there. The other one is Nabil Khalouf, who will be participating in the Q&A tonight and has prepared a video which I'm going to show you part of. Nabil is himself a Syrian refugee, now manages our projects in Lebanon and is a ceaseless tide of energy, enthusiasm and caring for people. One amongst 100,000 Syrian refugees who in the autumn of 2013 fled from their homes in the Kalamoun district of Syria to the nearby town of Arsal in Lebanon. This was because the Syrian regime had decided to clear the main Damascus-Tripoli highway by the simple expedient of barrel bombing all the villages on the road. Here you see people queuing to be registered with UNHCR, hoping for relief payments and shelter, and children in a reception center. And this is Arsal. People were queuing, as shown there, to register with UNHCR in the hope of being provided with tents. And tents were duly provided by UNHCR, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and other agencies. But a tent is not a home. Nevertheless, people were able to improve them with savings or earnings from odd jobs, work in the fields. Many tents were improved. Partition walls of blocks were built to separate kitchen and washing areas, an extra partition or room sometimes, and most important, a more solid wall and solid roof to protect from the storms in winter and searing heat in summer. Still cramped and uncomfortable, but something more like a home. In this picture you see an EDA-supported home workshop and a tent extension, and you see it's been decorated and shows what could be achieved. But as Maggie has already said, added to the everyday hardships of a refugee existence, there are periodic emergencies: fire, flood, storm, and nowadays hyperinflation, COVID-19, lockdown. But perhaps worst of all are government actions which affect refugees. In 2014, camps were shelled in a conflict between government forces and ISIS supporters who had infiltrated the camps. ISIS is away now, but in 2019, the government of Lebanon decreed that block walls in refugee shelters must not exceed 1 meter in height, and that if not done by month's end, the army would demolish everything by bulldozer. To comply with government orders, solid walls and roofs had to be replaced by wood and plastic. When compliance wasn't evident, the army came with bulldozers, and indeed did destroy a number of houses in a number of camps. With no choice, aid agencies supplied plastic and wood, and the refugees set to, as shown in this picture. But the elderly, the disabled, the widows bringing up children on their own, they couldn't do it by themselves. And this is where we came in. With materials supplied by Norwegian Refugee Council and a team which we assembled from those graduates of our vocational training courses, we undertook to demolish and rebuild the shelters in a community of disabled refugees with a 1-month army set deadline.
And sometimes we was work for about 15 hours per day to make people live quickly in this tent. I have an active role in this section. We choose some camps which have weak people and handicapped people who cannot make this demolition, and the widows camps.
Here is an example of one of the people, one of the inhabitants of that quadrangle, an elderly lady with a disabled husband. Without her, her home and all her possessions could well have been bulldozed. The demolitions are done, and surprisingly enough, although the materials were exceeding flimsy, the homes which we reconstructed have withstood 2 winters so far and will probably continue to serve. But now we are faced with hyperinflation and COVID-19. Inflation is always hard to understand, and in Lebanon it's particularly complicated because there are 2 currencies constantly in use. For smaller transactions, they use the Lebanese pound, and all ordinary shopping and groceries are bought in Lebanese pounds. Business usually works in dollars. Lebanon is not self-sufficient in food. Almost everything is imported. So if the pound goes down against the dollar, the price of food goes up. And as this chart shows, the Lebanese pound has sank in value against the dollar, so you now need many times as many pounds to buy dollars or to buy your groceries as you did previously. How this affects refugees in particular is terrible. UNHCR pays a meager $27 per month to each adult in a refugee family, but the exchange rate which they've been currently using is an exchange rate which was valid a year ago, 3,500 Lebanese pounds, whereas the actual price in goods is 13,500. What can EDA do? Well, we can't chase inflation away, but we can deliver food boxes to the most needy families. Not only refugees, some of the Lebanese in our south are in as desperate a state, as destitute as the refugee families. Another thing that's happening is because owners are now expecting more pounds in rent, and the families have not got enough anyway. They're not able to pay rent anymore. That is, families not living in tents, families living in converted garages or other makeshift accommodation rented to them by Lebanese. And many of them have now been evicted, or will be still. So one thing that we can do is we can help rehouse these families in tents by supplying construction materials to those rendered homeless. You might say, what are the construction materials for if you live in a tent? The answer is to build the floor of the tent and to build walls insofar as they're allowed, and to put in a slightly better roof with wooden support and plastic over. And of course, now there's the pandemic. Again, there's nothing EDA can do about the pandemic, but there are a few things that we can do to help. One of them is to supply PPE. How come? Well, we have a sewing workshop. And in this workshop, we are fortunate that some years ago, a company in Broughty Ferry closed down and donated their specialized medical fabrics to EDA. We sent these to Assar, where they were used occasionally for surgical overalls and the like.
These fabrics are ideal for making PPE. So our sewing workshop is now delivering many full PPE outfits for the medical teams in our south, and very many masks. Also, we've joined up with other Lebanese charities to form a small group trying to coordinate delivery of aid and medical checks in some parts of Lebanon. And here you see one of the medical teams organized by this consortium visiting a home of somebody who has either been diagnosed as infected and told to quarantine or is definitely ill. And she is checking, the health worker here is checking their oxygen levels with an oximeter, and behind we have oxygen cylinders, and there are also oxygen concentrators which are supplied, and the worker is wearing PPE made in our workshop. And again, food boxes, just relief to otherwise destitute families whose position has been so much worse by COVID. Hyperinflation has not gone away. No one knows how and when and if it will come to an end. COVID will perhaps subside. But for now, there are ongoing levels of destitution and they are increasing. All we can say is that we will continue to do what we can. Thank you. You will all remember the terrible explosion that took place in Beirut port in August last year. Maggie is now going to tell us what EDA and the wonderful team of Syrian refugees from our south rushed to provide in Beirut.
The first thing I'm going to show you is 300,000 people made homeless almost immediately, over 200 killed, 6,000 seriously injured, some of which, when I left at Christmas from Beirut, they're still in hospital with life-changing injuries, and more than 70% of Beirut buildings damaged, many beyond repair. So let's have a look at the explosion. Buildings just particularly in the port area of Karantina, a poor migrant area, next to the explosion that was decimated, completely decimated, but not just there. You have these town, city centre blocks where the wealthier people live, these rents were high. Every single window in these city centre blocks was blasted out. And this, of course, is where most of the injuries and deaths occurred, and also in the port area, the migrant area. And the blast, I have to tell you this, although we're short of time, the blast flowed through the city like a river, it was described to me by a scientist that I was speaking to. And it went round the back of buildings. So it didn't just destroy the front, it destroyed the back and the sides. And these children, this is their house behind them. These were migrant Syrian children in the area of Karantina. That's where we first started to focus our work. Immediately, well, it happened on the 4th of August. By the 6th of August, we had a 10-strong Syrian team trained in our own centre, in our salon construction skills, who Nabil brought down to Beirut. I was flying out on the same day to Beirut, and immediately there was two large workshops were set up. One was a sort of a very ad hoc one in Karantina itself, in the middle of the devastated area. And this was the one that our team set up very quickly. Had to be sheltered from the sun. The sun was desperate. This is most of our team are there. Some of them are outfitting, and this is where we first were. And then we after this initial bit of work, we were making windows there. They were making hundreds of windows in that first workshop you saw. Then we went into glass replacement because the needs for glass were huge. We had We had people coming in every 10 minutes begging for help, begging for glass, begging for windows, begging for repairs. And we set up our own glass workshop in another area, along with another carpentry workshop. And this is some of our team starting to glaze some windows there and doors. And most of the replacements were these balcony doors in very poor buildings on higher floors, completely blasted out. The buildings, interestingly enough, that survived the best were the buildings who'd actually had all their doors and windows open when that blast hit. Every building, like those big blocks of flats who had closed windows, of course, they're sealed, they were the ones that suffered the worst damage. So when there was an alarm about a second explosion coming when I was there, everybody threw open their windows and doors because they knew that would be safer. And this is Omar, one of our Syrian carpenters, very talented carpenter. He'd been a carpenter in Syria, and he's replaced some balcony doors in a migrant house, a migrant flat up on the 8th floor of a building in Karantina, and with some of those migrant children. Just a nice picture, really, to finish on, actually, I think. And so, in total, what we did, we replaced more than 2,700 windows and doors from August to December. Around 600 families all over the city received replacement windows and glass. Plus, we completely replaced every single window in a 5-story music centre for poor children, which actually it hasn't featured in here because there's not really very much time. And our Syrian team were away from their families for almost 5 months, earning money, but they missed their families. And they were a brilliant team. And it was a very, very hard 5 months for all of them.
Thank you, Maggie. Now we're going to shift focus and find out how it is all coordinated back home in Edinburgh. What about our warehouse and all the donations that flood in from Edinburgh and much wider around the UK? Over to Ian McHaffey, who chairs the Christine Whitcup Memorial Fund and who looks after the warehouse.
Thank you. Well, the first time I saw Jan and Dennis's room, it was like this. This was their front room with bags of clothing so high that you couldn't actually see out of the window. A warehouse was obviously necessary, and we've had 5 warehouses over this time. And this is our current one at 15A West Harbour Road, Granton. This gives us the space to bring in the bags of clothes and to pack these and sort them out, as you can see some of the volunteers are doing here. Goods come in from individuals. This is a Syrian family bringing some clothing in. Comes in from various community groups, often people who get together and do knitting as well as collecting clothing. You get church groups. This is a group down in Hoyk Community Church. Some nice clothing you can see knitted there. School groups supply toiletries, stationery. This is Lisa Anderson, the secretary of Edinburgh DIrect Aid, and 2 of the children helping to empty one of the vans. Here is Taizo. They give us lots of boots and we find them exceedingly helpful. And this is Rahina, former nurse in Spain, now one of our ardent helpers. Not everything that comes in, of course, is suitable, and we have to filter it out and either recycle it, or if clothes aren't quite clean enough, we take them home and wash them and bring them back again. These are some of our volunteers. This is after we've packed the containers, so we're having lunch together, and we've now got a bit more space because we've loaded a complete container. Volunteers come from different groups, from Jewish groups, as here, from Muslim groups, people doing Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, my grandson on the left there, for example. Some firms like Bailey Gifford give their employees a day or 2 days a year, and they come in and help. Here they're having lunch together in the yard, obviously. They've been working hard during the morning. The clothes are carefully packed into different categories in boxes like this. They need to be labelled, so we have an individual label for each box. And the boxes are then placed on pallets and labelled and cling film wrapped so that everything holds together. We need pallets, and pallets are expensive, but the university very kindly brings us pallets for free, and this is most helpful. There are other ways in which our volunteers help too. Steve here on the left, for example, goes round and picks up scrap metal off the beach and anywhere around the area, and so it gets recycled. But we take our scrap metal along to Wochs next door to our warehouse, and we get hundreds of pounds per year from scrap metal. A very good way of supporting our funds. Boxes are very expensive. If you try to buy them, you'll soon find out. Fortunately, two firms, Syca in Edinburgh and Smurfit Kappa down south, are very good at supplying us with boxes for free. And Smurfit Kappa came up with a design to make these boxes useful when they arrive in Lebanon. STV picked this up, and here is a little report.
Now, a Scottish charity is preparing to send its latest container of aid to Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and this time even the packaging will come in useful. Edinburgh DIrect Aid worked with a design company to make sure the boxes carrying the aid can be transformed into much-needed furniture. Kay Nicholson has more.
Syrian refugees are facing a cold winter in tents on the mountainous Lebanese border. They're desperately in need of warm clothing and other essentials. That's where Edinburgh DIrect Aid comes in. Today, almost 1,000 boxes of donations started a long journey to the Middle East.
Well, these boxes are all packed up and ready to go, filled with lots of goods and clothing. But after they're unpacked, they'll now have another use. For example, this box could be turned into a stool.
The specially designed boxes feature instructions in English and Arabic of how to convert them.
You can get access to a whole series of boxes instead of having to have one box on top of another, change it around to get inside it. They open, you can use them as cupboards, you can store stationery and anything else you want to store in them. So it's a really useful reuse of the packaging instead of the box being not so helpful.
The charity has been running aid schemes for more than 2 decades, and volunteers say it's satisfying to get involved.
It's brilliant because, I mean, we just fill in the time that we have available, and we just one small cog in the wheel that gets everything out there.
When we had our grandchildren, when our grandchildren were born, I just realised how lucky they were and how some children are, have such a terrible start that, we wanted to do something to help.
The delivery is due to arrive in Lebanon at the end of next month, and it's hoped the makeshift furniture will be an added bonus. Kay Nicholson, STV News, Edinburgh.
Well, you've seen some of the big cogs, Dennis and Jan and Maggie and Nabil, but the rest of us are small cogs, but the small cogs help to make the whole thing work. And here we are getting ready to load a container. We borrow a forklift truck from one of the nearby firms for free. We use it to load the pallets. We have a team of people carrying boxes on as well. And this needs to be packed carefully inside, putting in every square inch that we can pack so that we get as much on as possible. And here, a few months ago, is our most recent container. It was more difficult because of COVID-19. We had to space ourselves out. We had to wear masks. But it meant that we had successfully packed the container and done something to help the people of whom we have been speaking. It wouldn't work without the volunteers, without the people who give donations of clothes, of money. So we'd like to thank all the individuals, the groups, the firms, the organisations who donated these things, materials, supplies, and of course, we'd like to say thanks to all our very, very willing volunteers. Right now, we've had to close because of COVID-19, although the warehouse has been ticking over in the background. We'll be opening again soon, so please do have a look at the Edinburgh DIrect Aid website. Search for Edinburgh DIrect Aid, or you can type in the details and you'll get these on the screen in a moment. There's the door and we'll be open shortly. And when we open, this is the kind of thing we need. We need volunteers, we need clothing of all sorts, we need toiletries, we need school supplies like paper, pens and pencils, computers that are Windows 10 capable, and here is our website, www.edinburgh.org. edinburghdirectaid.org. Please look at the warehouse and find out when we're reopening and the kind of things we're then like. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ian. Nobody is a small cog in Edinburgh DIrect Aid. We couldn't do without all the volunteers. And nobody's a big cog, I should say. So thank you to everybody, and we always welcome new people expressing an interest in Edinburgh DIrect Aid. Now we come full circle back to St Andrews and St George's, because I'm going to introduce Dorothy Mackenzie, and she's going to tell us about how the church group have helped EDA. Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you, Jan. I represent Creative Together, which is a group of people from the three Together congregations in the centre of the city who are interested in crafts. And many of the people who are involved in this group have been supporting EDA for quite some time. But as a group, our support of EDA began in 2018. That was the year that EDA launched the Big Knit. And we decided as a group to launch our own event called Knit for a Bit. And we invited people to drop in to our church on George Street to spend as long as they liked during the day knitting and putting some money in a bucket too for EDA. So we produced all sorts of things that day, and we raised £650. One of the things that we did that day was knit things like this. It doesn't look very much, does it? Talk about small cogs. But if you knit a lot of these, you get this. A nice warm blanket, which we hope will give warmth to the people in the camps in Lebanon. And over the time, we've kept doing this, and we've knitted a few more. These are the ones that are currently waiting to go to the EDA warehouse when it reopens. It's absolutely wonderful to see the people, to see some pictures of the people that are benefiting from what we're doing. I'm particularly moved to see the pictures of the children, because it's mainly for the children that we make this other item. And these are called trauma teddies. They're soft, knitted, cuddly, and we hope provide something in the way of comfort for children who have lost everything. We'll continue to make these things, blankets and teddies, for as long as they're required. But we're also ready to turn our skills as such as we have to anything the EDA would ask us to continue making. And anyone can do this, you know. It doesn't have to just be folk and creative together. You can join us in doing this if you want. We've got patterns for these. You can St Andrews and St George's website and find the contact email on that, which is admin@stagw. Find it on the website. Email us and we will be delighted to give you patterns for these. The more people join in to do this, the more support we can give to EDA. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. That is just such a very good example of what knitting and crafts can do for people in need at the other end. And knitting is such a universal skill around UK, and we now have support from Shetlands down to Cornwall through the organisation Loving Hands, and we are so grateful for all of these. You might think we might be flooded with these things and it's too much, but remember, at least 6,000 children in our cell alone, and many more of them going on to becoming adolescents. Babies coming all the time, so keep sending them in, please. Thank you. And now it's your turn. We're going to turn to Andrew to chair a question and answer session, and it's your opportunity to ask anything you want of any of us.
Thank you, Jan. It's a very short question and answer, and I'll make myself unpopular by excluding lots of people who would like to ask questions, because in addition to the questions which are on the chat, there are others being sent in. I want first to ask Elspeth McGregor, and Sarah will, I hope, be able to find Elspeth. Now, Elspeth has sent in 2 questions, but Elspeth, I'm afraid we've only got time for one of them, and it's your question about coordination.
Yes, my question is, I'm very interested in all these different organisations all working together, but how is it coordinated? Who's in charge, so to speak, and who allocates the tasks that have to be done?
Well, it's a very complicated question in a way, because things constantly change so much in our SAL, which is the area where we're most working. So you've heard about the emergencies that we have to deal with, and those can crop up at any time. So we have a contingency to deal with that. Nabil, our manager in our SAL, is in touch certainly with me every day, and with Dennis also very, very frequently. Really, I think Dennis is going to come in on this as well, I think.
Yep.
And perhaps Nabil would explain, could say a word or two about how we coordinate with other agencies in our SAL.
Nabil.
Yes, we can make coordination with other agencies by municipality. In Ersal municipality, we make many meetings every 15 days, all the NGO. That between the NGOs which work in Ersal.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Let's move on. Jan mentioned an honoured name in the EDA community, the name of Christine Whitcutt, and I know Lorna Cammock wants to make a very brief comment about Christine.
Yes, Christine Whitcutt was a teacher in my school in Wishaw, long before I was in any connection with Edinburgh. And she was very musical. She played piano beautifully, and every year she produced a top-rate musical using the children in the school. And about 5 years ago I met her daughter, Julie, and she also had a wee boy, Paul, and we knew them as pupils too. So I wondered whether anybody's in touch with Julie and Paul. It was at a celebration of a birthday that I met Julie.
Ian, perhaps.
Ian, are you perhaps the person to answer this?
Oh, yes. I mean, David Hamilton, her husband, is actually on the video, is on at the moment, I think. David, are you there?
Really?
Hello there, yes. Julie and David here.
Okay, oh, good. Oh, that's better. So, oh, excellent.
Yes, absolutely lovely words, Lorna.
Yes,
David, could you say just, David, before you say the comment, could you, for people who can't remember who Christine Whitcutt is, could you just say 2 or 3 sentences about why she's so important?
Certainly. So Christine was an aid worker with Edinburgh DIrect Aid, and she was killed in 1993 in Sarajevo. And really, I think since then we've got the Christine Whitcutt Memorial Centre in Sarajevo in her memory. And I was fortunate enough to marry her daughter, Julie. And so that's, I was just listening to the show, I feel like, this afternoon. It's been really interesting, and it's great to see the work of EDA continuing.
David, you were fortunate to marry her, but you married her because she deserved you.
I doubt that. Nobody deserves me.
Thank you very much for that comment, Lorna. I'm really sorry that that's all the time we have for questions, but Jan has undertaken that she will answer any questions which arise from this.
Yes, the email address for that is very simple. It's just hq@edinburgh.directaid.org, and do send them in. And for a final comment now, I'm just going to go back to Dennis, just to wrap it up.
I want to talk briefly about money. We're an all-volunteer organisation, of course. Well, that's not quite true. We do pay refugees and others in beneficiary countries. We pay them at local rates. And when we've had big reconstruction projects, staff were of necessity seconded to and paid by the contract. But our UK-based staff are volunteers. No one is paid for working in the warehouse, for doing our accounts, or presenting PowerPoints for that matter. When we work overseas, we of course incur travel expenses, and all our volunteers, this is not compulsory, but most of our volunteers, all our volunteers I would say, who can do so, contribute their travel expenses up to the point that they can afford it. As a result, we can carry out programs on a fraction of the money that a big professional agency would need to spend. But nevertheless, like everyone else, we run on money. How does it go? Where does it go to? Well, this table gives you an idea. This is partly an estimate because it's for the whole of this financial year. Our financial year runs from June to July, which isn't over yet. But we estimate that by the end of this financial year, we'd have spent some £160,000 in the ways shown here. Where does it come from? Well, as Jan has already said, a good deal of it comes from trust funds, very occasionally from government, but most of it comes from you and me and everybody listening. How do you get it to us? Well, there are various different ways. You can send a check, you can do a bank transfer. If you do a bank transfer, we'd appreciate it if you sent a note, including your name and address and email. We always desire these, so we can send you a thank you letter, but if you're authorizing gift aid, we do need these absolutely. And most of our donors donate not by check or bank transfer, but by card or by PayPal account. And to do this, just go to our website, click on Donations Cash, and if you find it awkward or something goes wrong or you prefer to, you can always give us a call and we can take the donation by cash. Thank you.
And now, finally, back to Dorothy for the administrative and thank yous.
I think you'll all agree that this has been a very inspiring time together. It's been a privilege for me to work with Jean and Dennis in preparing for this afternoon, and to meet Maggie and Nabil and Ian. I want to thank everyone for their contributions to this event, but also for the 7 years of commitment on the part of EDA to the Syrian refugees in Arsal. The war in Syria has been going on now for 10 years. It's hard to imagine what that means for the people who have been displaced, who have suffered so much, who have lost so much, and there doesn't seem to be any end to the destruction, the violence, and it's hard to know what to do to help. So it's been very exciting for me to hear about a local organization that has committed to support a very specific group of refugees in a specific and very difficult place. And they're making a huge difference. Meeting immediate material needs like oil and food and clothing, but also providing hope for the future through education and vocational training. So I do encourage you to do what you can to support EDA and to pray for an end to the war in Syria so that someday these people can go home. The border is just right there. Nabil's home is only a few miles away from where he's living, and they look forward to that day. So thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.